Hello friends, Jenkins Dota here, bringing you another Dota 2 video on behalf of DotaAlchemy.com, and this video is going to be on the fact that not all objectives are created equally. And this video is going to be in response to the fact that a lot of the time when I'm coaching, I'll see somebody assaulting an objective, or they will be in a particular area, they'll die, I'll say that that's a bad death. In another situation, they'll die somewhere and I'll say that that's a good death. And a lot of the time, the reason that I say that is because you want to be around a specific objective at a specific point in Dota, because of course the game is about objectives, it is not about kills. And people are always a little confused when I tell them they shouldn't be at a certain tier 1, but maybe they should be at another tier 1. And basically the reasoning behind that is because not every objective is equal. You want to be positioned in a certain area of the map. You want to be around the objective that you want to take next. And basically, what I'm going to be doing in this video is I'm going to be laying out a tier system, and I don't mean tier 1, 2, 3. I'm going to be laying out an order of how difficult the objectives are to take, each objective in Dota, and talking a little bit about why I ranked them at that difficulty. And that's a large reason that I tell people they shouldn't be in an area, and it's simply because they do not have the net worth to take a certain tier of objective. So positioning around it is simply useless, because if they go for a fight and try to take that objective, they'll get wiped, and usually that's what happens. Or if they're just sitting in that area while they're not getting an objective. And in Dota, you want to focus on objectives. Kills don't matter, objectives matter, the throne matters. So without further ado, let's just go ahead and get into the tier list. So the way that I'm going to tier these objectives is by giving them a letter grade, and that is simply to avoid confusion with the tier 1, 2, 3, etc. system that already exists within Dota. And this is going to be similar to how the fighting game community grades their characters, where they have letters, and the S tier, standing for super, is the highest tier, where it's like just like the absolutely broken characters that are usually banned. A tier, amazing characters. B tier, C tier, D tier, and so forth, where like the D tier characters usually aren't picked at all because they suck ass. So in Dota, in my opinion, there is only one D tier objective, 2 if you're counting both sides, and that is the safe lane tier 1. This guy is incredibly hard to defend, and for good reason. So the very first reason is because there is this massive distance between the tier 1 and the tier 2. Which means if you want to defend this tower and you realize, oh, we can't fight this, and you scurry to your tier 2 for some defenses, because of course this guy's really strong, well, look how far you have to run. It's not so simple. You can't just run. If this tower dies, you're probably screwed. So that's dangerous. And then with that being said, there's all this fog here. The enemy team could just be chilling here. And there's all of this area for wards and sentries, where if the enemy team shows up to this and places a ward and a sentry, you're kind of screwed, because how are you going to deward that? There's so much potential space here for ganks and for interceptions and such. So the second reason that the space is a huge deal is basically that if you want to TP to defend this tower, you have to do it preemptively, because otherwise you're going to endure that TP cooldown. Every time somebody TPs to a tower, it adds like 2 or 3 seconds or whatever to the next TP, scaling up to like 5 or 6. And basically, the first TP will work, so you can only do 1 TP to this tower, so people will have to preemptively have teleported here, or teleported to the tier 2 and already set up to defend this tower. And that doesn't happen much in pubs, because there isn't much communication in pubs, or collaboration in pubs. So a lot of the time, I see this mistake where people in other lanes, so for instance offlaners in particular, will try to TP in to their carry who's bitching that they don't want to lose their tier 1 because they're getting destroyed by an aggressive dual lane. They TP in, they get wiped because of those staggering TPs, and they just lose the tier 2 as well. So that it's super game losing. I see a lot of people losing because of that TP cooldown that is added for TPing to this tower. And the reason that the space is a big deal for that is because a lot of the time, like let's say you're defending this tower, okay, you can just TP to this one and there's not that much space, right? But you cannot TP here because it's so far away. You cannot TP to the shrine because it's so far away. If a fight starts and you're not already there, you're basically fucked. Unless all of you are there minus 1 person. 1 person can TP into this tower to defend it, and that's it. So sometimes it's worth it if you can TP 1 person in and defend it. That's definitely worth it. But if there's like a full-out siege on this tower, you are completely screwed because of that space and the TP cooldowns. So another reason that this tower is incredibly hard to defend is because a lot of the time in the current meta, there are these aggressive dual lanes that exist. And I know that's not always going to be how it is, but a lot of the time when there are these aggressive dual lanes, that lane is really strong. So somebody from one of the other lanes will go to that lane as kind of a first rotation, take that tower because it'll be free, because a lot of the time in these aggressive dual lanes, somebody will go in jungle or go rotate somewhere else. So the safe lane is usually the weakest lane right now. And even if that is not the case, in metas where the safe lane is actually the strongest lane, what happens, at least in high-level pubs, is that the safe laner will rotate to the off lane to try and kill the enemy carry to shut them down. And as a result, what happens is that even in the opposite meta from how it is now, the safe lane tower still dies first and is the most dangerous lane to be in, because if it's the safest lane, you want to kill the guy there. If it's the most dangerous lane, it's the easiest lane to take that tower, so you go to it. So in every case, in basically every meta so far, the safe lane tower dies first. One caveat that I want to add is basically that this is the first tower that gets sieged as a team in most games, but it's not necessarily the first tower that dies. That doesn't mean it's not the easiest objective to take. It just means that in most cases, this is the first tower that dies as a team. And so in this game, for example, we have this mid lane tower is gone, and so is the enemy mid lane tower, but that doesn't really matter. But essentially, EG has taken this mid lane tower, and the reason for that is because, of course, there are exceptions to this rule. Sometimes there are just random fights that occur in the mid lane. It's like, okay, we have a siege creep, well, let's go take the tower. Or mid lane gets dumpstered and you take a tower. Or the safe lane gets dumpstered and you take that tower. And a lot of the time, either mid or safe lane will win, which means that there will at least be some damage on those towers, if not taking them. But that's usually in the laning phase and not as a team. It's not really a setup where it's like, okay, let's group up and take this objective. This is almost always the first objective that is taken as a team, and that is just a little caveat that I wanted to add in there at the end. So the next tier of objectives is the C tier of objectives, and in this category, in my opinion, there are two towers. The safe lane tier 2 is in this category, and the mid tier 1, which in this game no longer exists for either side. EG has moved on to the A tier of objectives, which is this mid tier 2. And the only reason that they've done that is because they have a massive, massive net worth lead of 7k at 21 minutes and an Aegis on Sumail, so the risk is more than certainly worth the reward in this scenario. So let's start with this tower, this safe lane tier 2. Why is this more difficult to take than this tower? You might be wondering, Jenkins, isn't the distance between the tier 2 and the tier 3 the same as the distance between the tier 2 and the tier 1? And I would say, yeah, they're equal. But with that being said, there is this shrine that can be teleported to. And you can see that the distance between the tier 2 and the shrine is obviously much less than the distance between the shrine and the tier 1. So essentially, if you want to defend this tower and you are the Dire, you can TP one person here, TP one person here, and you will get there relatively quickly with both of those TPs, and then the other TPs will stagger. So either you want to be strong on those first two heroes to TP in, or you want to just not give a shit about them TPing at all. So there's that. So that's why it's a little bit harder. And then there's also the fact that this is a tier 2, which of course just has higher stats. It has 2 more armor and about 40 more damage. So that very literally makes it harder to take. With that being said, I would say that this still is a relatively easy to take tower in the grand scheme of things. And I would say that a large mistake that I see a lot of people make, at least in the coaching sessions that I've done, is that they will focus on all of the tier 1s instead of going for this tier 2, which is actually easier to take than this tier 1, for example, unless you've already done a lot of damage to it in the laning phase. A lot of the time people will completely change their map orientation away from the enemy jungle, which of course is terrible because you want to occupy the enemy jungle because you want to be in a position where if the enemy team kills you, they have to walk a huge distance to get to your base, and if you kill them, you can take their objectives, which of course is being on their side of the map. So if you play to this tower, you are playing on your own side of the map. That is very, very game losing, and it's harder to take. So it's just 2 birds, 1 stone, except in the opposite way, more like 2 stones and 1 bird. So it's pretty bad. So that's a big mistake that I see people make, is that they don't go for this tower when it's very easy to take, and they go for this one, and then they lose. So that is why this tower is harder to take than this one. Mid tower. You might be wondering, this is a tier 1, Jenkins. How could you possibly group this with a tier 2? There are a few reasons for that. So this tower is relatively hard to take because since, I don't know how many patches ago it was, but it's been this way for quite some time. This tower is very, very close to the river, which means if you smoke and you try to run by it, you literally can't without breaking the smoke from either angle on both sides. so you can't smoke by this tower at all, which makes it an incredibly important tower to keep alive. It's also incredibly important to keep alive because it secures the Roche pit, it secures the center of the map, which of course gives you a very quick run to any area of the map if you just teleport to the tower and then run there. So it's a very nice tower to have alive, and as a result, people are very, very they will defend it. They will defend this tower if you are playing people who value towers at all. So there's that reason. And then of course, because the towers are so close to the river, there is a lot of vision that they give, and you are either on the low ground, which is bad, or you are in vision and getting revealed your invis, as well as having the tower, you know, see you and potentially hit you. So there's just like this spatial element to this tower just makes it so incredibly difficult to take, because it's very, very easy for the enemy team to just have you be fighting in their tower. It's not like up here where you could just take a fight right here in this tower. I mean, it doesn't do fucking anything because it's just way back here. But with this mid tower, it's like you could fight. You're either downhill, which is bad, or you're fighting in their tower if you want to fight on the uphill. Because you're not going to fight over here because people will just run directly to their tower. It's such a small space here that it's much, much harder to fight in this area. But with that being said, this is still an easier tower to take than these ones or this one. And that's simply because you were very likely already going to be positioned in the enemy team's jungle and have a lot of wards up here. You can see that EG did have wards up here, but BGJ have actually just dewarded them because they're a really good team. So essentially, this tower is grouped with a tier 2, even though it does significantly less damage and has a little bit less armor, simply because of the spatial element to it being very hard to siege, just because it's so goddamn close to that river. And then also, with that being said, the distance between the tier 1 and the tier 2 is significantly less, so it's relatively easy to TP to this tier 2 to defend this tier 1, and you can just go set up in the trees. A lot of people will be positioned in this jungle or this jungle farming safely, which means that they could very easily get to this mid tower to defend it, rather than if you want to defend your safe lane tier 1, you're going to have a lot of heroes move a huge distance. For instance, if anybody's over here, they can't just walk top. If somebody's over here, they can't really walk top to this area, whereas if somebody's farming this jungle, if somebody's farming this jungle over here, then they just walk to the middle lane to defend it. So it's a lot easier to defend for that reason. It's just very convenient to go defend that, and it's very, very important to defend. But with that being said, it still is a tier 1. It still is where you want to position your team, which is in the enemy jungle. So it's very, very convenient to just go boom, boom, boom. You take these 3 towers and then secure Roshan, and then it's kind of flowchart Dota from there. So the next tier of objectives is the B tier, and this is once again another tier of objectives that actually only contains one element, and that is the offlane tier 1. The reason that you don't want to siege this guy is basically because of one reason, maybe 2, there's an argument for 2, but mostly because of one reason, and that is simply because you want to be playing on the enemy side of the map as much as you can in Dota if you just want to play an efficient game. And the reason for that is because, let's say you are these guys, you're Radiant, and you're playing in the enemy jungle. Of course, it is a lot of farm to get all of these camps and then secure these camps as well, as a result of creating this kind of barrier here by being in this jungle. But if you die and get wiped in their jungle, by the time they get to your tower, any of your objectives, because it's their side of the map that they have to run from, the very literal distance is quite far. And then also, in order to siege a tower, you need to get the creeps to the tower. So it's very, very hard to get wiped in the enemy jungle and to actually lose an objective from that. So it's very low risk to play in the enemy jungle. Then with that being said, if you kill them in their jungle, you can take their objectives because it's very, very close, and it's likely that if you're farming in that area, the creep wave will be pushed out already to their towers. So basically, you want to be on the enemy side of the map at almost any point in Dota if you can, simply because it is very efficient, and this guy is the farthest thing away from their goddamn side of the map other than being on your side of the map, which is, by the way, very terrible to be on in most cases. So that's kind of the only reason. It's a tier 1, so it's actually relatively easy to take, and that's why it is in the B tier on its own. I would say that it is a little bit harder to take than the other tier 1s, simply because the distance between this tier 2 and this tier 1 is very insignificant. So you can TP one person here, TP one person here, and that's 2 TPs. There's that. And then there's also the fact that the shrine is over here. That's relatively close as well. I mean, it's not as close as like this shrine to here, but it's still closer than, you know, this shrine to this tier 1. So it's definitely got its perks to defend this if you are the Dire side or if you're the Radiant side defending this. But mostly you don't want to be sieging the offlane tier 1 unless you have a lot of net worth, simply because you're going to have to completely change your map orientation away from what you want it to be. And if you can't get that back, oh my god, is it game losing and very, very inefficient. So the next tier of objectives is the A tier of objectives, and in this category I would say there are two towers. There is this middle lane tier 2 tower, and then there is this off lane tier 2 tower. And I want to take a moment right now to just analyze what happens on the map, what happens with the enemy team when you're taking their objectives. And I don't mean in the current meta, I just mean in Dota in general. So essentially, when you take objectives, the enemy team has less places to teleport to place wards, which means they'll have less vision in areas that you take objectives. So for example, up here, EG took this objective. There is no vision around here because the enemy team has not had the opportunity to come up here because this tower is dead. They feel a lot less safe in this area because a lot less of their teammates can get to them because this tower is dead. So only really the people who are very quick or people who have blink daggers can help you if you get into a tricky situation way out here. So essentially, the enemy team, their map gets smaller and smaller and smaller where they can occupy safely. And one analogy that I want to make is what happens if you corner a dog, even a very nice dog that is just very nervous. If you corner that dog, it will bite you. It will tear you apart. And that is what happens with players in Dota as well. When you corral them more and more into their base, it's very likely that they will have no choice but to fight you. So if you are taking objective after objective after objective, and you get to these higher tiers of objectives, you are going to have a fight that is significant. So you want to have a large gold lead. I see that a lot in games where people very easily take the towers in the order that I listed, where they'll take the tier 1, they'll take the mid tier 1, they'll take the tier 2 up here, and then they'll go for these other towers, and oh my god, is it significantly harder. They get wiped, they lose, and they wonder why they lost those fights. And it's essentially because you're corralling the enemies. You are cornering a vicious dog, or whatever, a nice dog that is going to become vicious. So essentially, that is a huge reason, in my opinion, these towers are very hard to take. They are the opposite of where you want to be on the map in terms of positioning, so they are always the last objectives. The last objectives to take are going to be the hardest ones to take because the enemy team is very likely to be in position to defend them because you're cornering them. With that being said, the distance between these two towers and the shrine is fairly insignificant, which means people can use this to heal. If the enemy team takes a fight here, they can actually use this as a portable fountain, which is very convenient. They can do a bit of a wraparound by TPing to this, wrap around like an initiator or something like that. That's very dangerous for you, which is why you want to have BKBs before you siege this, and Manta Styles and Blinks and these items that can help you avoid those potential wraparounds without just getting caught out. So there's a lot of items that you need to avoid those wraparounds. I would say that for this level of tower, for the A tier towers, you want to have a ward and a sentry for these towers, or a massive gold lead and good team fight, because the ward and sentry, for the most part, you want those simply because you know that this fight is going to be significant. And if VGJ's run through, I believe it was, or it wasn't VGJ at the time, it was Vici, through TI4, their run through TI4 taught us that if you place a ward and a sentry in a fight, that fight is going to be significantly easier than if you didn't. So you really want to have a ward and a sentry for these towers, and if the enemy team doesn't, it's very likely that because you have the ward and the sentry, your fight will be a lot better. And if they have the ward and the sentry, your fight's going to be a lot worse. So you absolutely need it for these objectives, because it's basically a prisoner's dilemma where the person who has it will win. So that's why these objectives are in this tier, as well as the fact that it's very easy to TP to the base. You can TP, to all of these towers. There is no cooldown on that, obviously, because there are so many towers to TP to in here that you can just teleport to this racks, teleport to this tower here, and the cooldown is dependent on the building that you teleport to. So that cooldown from TPs is not a problem for these towers because they're so close to the base. It's also very likely at this point of the game the enemy team is going to have some mobility items, blink daggers, phase boots, blink daggers, all of these items. Blink dagger on Wyvern, like they have all of these items where they can actually set up very easily at this point in the game. So basically all of these elements make it so these two final outer towers are significantly harder to siege than the other ones. And a lot of the time what you actually want to do in Dota is take this tier 1 tower, this tier 2 tower, this tier 1 tower, and then you say, okay guys, let's chill out, force the enemy team to have less farm than us, and then once we have BKBs, once we have better items, maybe even have an Aegis, we'll siege the A tier towers, because good god are they hard to take. So the next objective that is in the A tier of objectives, and I would actually say that this is maybe A-, simply because I see a lot of people taking an Aegis before they siege the other A tier objectives, and that is Roshan. I think Roshan is in the A tier of objectives, and the main reason for that is simply because if you have objectives taken, it's significantly easier to take Roshan. And by default, taking Roshan is incredibly hard simply because this area is devastatingly difficult to fight in if you aren't at a significant advantage if the enemy team is there. Imagine fighting into the Roche Pit against that Winter Wyvern curse. Imagine fighting into the Roche Pit against the Supernova from the Phoenix. Basically, both teams in any game are going to have heroes that are very, very hard to fight in choke points just because there's so many heroes in Dota that are really good at doing just that. So essentially, by default, Roche is hard to take, and as you take objectives, it gets easier and easier and easier, simply because if you take towers, then you have your creep wave pushed very close to the enemy base, which means that you're going to have vision of them. They want to defend that, of course, because if they don't defend that and they lose a fight, well, then a lane of creeps is pushed into their base, which turns off the backdoor protection, which means that the tower or the racks will die. So it's very dangerous for the enemy team to just have that creep wave in their base. So a lot of the time they'll go deal with it, and then you can take Roshan for free once you've pushed in that wave, which is way easier than just taking Roshan flat out. And then with that being said, if you don't see the enemy team in a lane where they should be pushing it out, then you know that they're going to fight that Roshan pit. If they go in, you wipe them. If they don't go in, you wait for them to go back. It's very, very easy to take Roshan if you have towers. Very, very hard otherwise. So basically what I would say, and this is probably the most common thing that I see in pubs and high-level competitive games, is that people essentially will take the tier 1 top, they will take the tier 2 and the tier 1 in no particular order, then they will take this tier 1, maybe get a couple kills over here, get a few wards down or something like that, and then eventually they'll change their map positioning to be around Roshan, take the Aegis, push down either this lane or this lane, and then push into racks, try to get high ground, or push one of these towers. Sometimes, if there's a significant advantage, these towers will come before the Roshan simply because it's easy to do that. You push in the wave, they have to deal with it, and then you go back and Roshan maybe after killing one or two of them. But basically what happens is that after the A tier of objectives, you basically need an Aegis. And to get into that A tier, I would say that you need a ward and a sentry. So if you're trying to fight Roshan, you probably want to have a ward and a sentry. If you're fighting on the Radiant side, you probably want to put a ward and a sentry here, or a sentry by the pit, and then a ward up here. And if you're fighting from the Dire side, you want to put a ward up here and probably a sentry here. You can see even right now, EG has a ward and a sentry here because they just took the Aegis on Alchemist. So you need that to fight Roche just because it's such a hard objective to take. So the final set of objectives, and absolutely the hardest set of objectives, and probably the most common place in Dota that people throw the game, is the S tier of objectives, and that is sieging high ground. So I would say that these towers, that is the tier 3 towers, are equivalent in terms of difficulty as taking the racks and the tier 4s as well. The tier 4s are actually relatively easy to take when compared to these to the racks, even though there's 2 of them. There's this high ground, which makes it kind of equivalent, so I'd say it's kind of equivalent. If you made me rank these wells out here, I would say that these shrines are very easy to take. They're pretty insignificant because I think if you take racks, then the wells just follow suit. And I think most Dota games reflect that. It's very, very easy to take these shrines after you've taken the racks. So why is high ground so ridiculously hard to take? Well, a huge reason for that is because there's this low ground here. So you are fighting into high ground, which means heroes like Clinks are going to miss and have that uphill miss chance. And then also there's the lack of vision. So you absolutely need a ward to siege high ground. Any objective past the A tier, I would say if you don't have a ward and a sentry, you're pretty much screwed. And you can see that Fly just placed a ward here. These are really nice ward spots. You can place them for each of these tier 3s, and there's even ones on the side here. I would say that these wards are so important that you can even place them right on the tower and just defend them, and just if the enemy team comes, you kill them, because they're that important that you can reveal the ward. If you don't have that ward, I would say you don't even fight that, because this low ground and this hill here essentially makes it so you cannot see up here, but the enemy team of course sees because their entire base is here. So it's all lit up for them, and for you it is just darkness. So it is terrifying. Along with that mischance, it makes it so hard to kill these towers. With that being said, these towers also have an incredible amount of armor and a high amount of damage, so it's hard to take them. There are these tier 4s here that the enemy team can run to. They intercept with each other, so 2 tier 4s can hit you at once if you dive a little bit too deep which is obviously very dangerous. The creep spawn is right here, so you're fighting all of those creeps, and your creeps will stop hitting the tower and start hitting those creeps if they're here. With that being said, this is also the enemy base, so if you kill them all once, they can very likely have buyback, and just you need to kill them all again. So if you want to push high ground, you basically need to be in a scenario where you know that you're snowballing so hard, or they have no buybacks, that basically you can fight them all twice, or like I said, they won't have any buybacks. And then, with that being said, the enemy team doesn't even need to die, and they can get full mana and full HP simply because the well is right here. So they can just run all the way back, very, very easy, and then get back into the fight by TPing or just by walking because it's very, very quick. Obviously, they have really good vision because it's their base, but they can also place a ward, and it's very hard to deward that because you can't place a sentry when there's the tower vision. You can just deward the sentry. So the enemy team can place a ward and get tons of vision out here. So it's very, very hard to take this. And as you can see in this game, EG, they go for it because they are kind of in a snowballing lead. I would say that if you do siege high ground, you probably want to have some sort of way that you're going to play it where you slow siege. This is the complete opposite of slow sieging. Sumail's being a madman, but as a result, Arteezy, because he's the sieging hero, he's just hitting the racks. Then they turn to fight because he doesn't have the strafe anyway, and then Sumail's going in, so they're kind of scared that he's going to die twice and that it's going to be a throw. So they're like, okay, we're just going to fight this. We have egg. But in any case, essentially, if you want to try to push high ground, you usually want to do it in an orderly manner where you are either killing all of them because you have kill heroes and snowballing like this, or you want to have them all already be dead, or you want to be sieging with like a Clinks just hitting and then an Alk taking the damage and being very, very careful with it. And if you can't do that, I would actually say this is probably one of the most common places where I see people throw pubs, is that they do exactly what Sumail did, except without a professional team backing them up and without a 10k gold lead and being alchemist with Aegis. People will do stuff like that because high grounding is very, very hard, and then they will throw. And one of the very easy ways that you can just win a game, if you can't go high ground because it is in the final tier of objectives, so it's very, very difficult to take, is that you can simply put down good vision on the edges of the map as deep as possible towards the enemy base and just choke the enemy team out, and if they ever exit the base, you annihilate them. That is a very, very easy way to secure a game, and then you just wait until you have like a 10-20k net worth lead, and then you go high ground. That is a very, very easy way to win Dota, and I see a lot of people throwing games because they're like, oh, we got a kill, oh, let's go high ground, and then the guy buys back, and then you get wiped because you're fighting into all of that bullshit that I mentioned, and it's just so goddamn difficult. So goddamn difficult when you can just choke the enemy team out. But in this case, we have a professional team, so they did the whole kind of snowballing into high ground thing because they knew their limits. But in pubs, for the most part, following flowchart Dota, it works. It'll win you a lot of games.